Welcome, everyone. This is June 21st, 2017. We are at the Southgate Center of the Mindfulness Community of Milwaukee, the home of the Stillwater Sangha. And we are doing this summer a series of talks related to mindfulness in the Thich Nhat Hahn tradition. The overview of the talks will be, if you truly pay attention to your life, you'll be happier, more peaceful, and your life will go better both for yourself and for others. That's pretty much it. So those of you who wish to kind of spend your Wednesdays at Jazz in the Park or something, you can feel free to go do that, because that's the whole thing. But I'm hoping that maybe we can flesh out this a little bit and more try to get people to be inspired to do the practice rather than I'm trying to give a lot of information. And there are a lot of inspirational people that we will talk about. So I'm going to try to describe mindfulness in the Thich Nhat Hahn tradition with words. I'm afraid that's all I've got, but it's a very difficult task only in the fact that words are only an approximation for anything. It's sort of like trying to draw a picture while wearing boxing gloves. You can do it, but it's not entirely accurate. If you truly want to get an idea about what mindfulness is, I'm hoping that you can be inspired to practice. The topic of tonight's talk is about embracing life. And I'm going to give a little overview of that, but I'm also going to tell stories about three very important people. The first is Gautama Siddhartha, who became the Buddha. The second is Thich Nhat Hahn, who has been an inspiration to people practicing in this center for a while. And the third, well, we'll save the third towards near the end. So embracing life is always a challenge. Many people feel like their life is a runaway truck or a tiger that is chasing them, and they have no desire to embrace their life. They feel they'll be consumed by it. They feel they'll be run over by it. Other people feel that their life is just dull and that they have a difficult time with embracing joy and finding things in ordinary life. Many people feel disconnected from life. There is a wonderful sort of story by James Joyce called A Case. I forget what the name of it is, but it's about a Mr. Duffy. And Mr. Duffy is described as living a short distance from his body. And that is the way most of us are living. We are living a short distance from our lives. And until we kind of turn to face that, then we will be missing out, as what Thich Nhat Hahn says is our appointment with life. So let's settle in, let's have a sound of the bell, and take a breath or two. Thank you. I have my two friends here. The first is the person who became known as the Buddha, although there are many Buddhas, including many in this room. He was a rich prince, a person who had been pampered most of his life. When he was very young, an infant, a seer came to his father, who was the king of this small province in northeastern India. When I say king, it sounds like it's a big deal, but it's more like being the king of Milwaukee. It wasn't like a king of like a large area. And the seer said, this person will either grow up to be a great teacher or a great emperor. The king, wanting, of course, his son to go into his business, decided to do everything that he could to make sure that his son kind of hung around. He didn't want him to be a great teacher. He wanted him to be a great emperor. And so he was pampered. He had a winter palace, a summer palace, and a rainy season palace. He had the finest clothes and education. He had the ability to summon people for music whenever he wanted to. He was taught the martial arts. He was taught all kinds of educational things. So he had entertainment and opportunity galore. And yet he was unsatisfied. This seems like a relatively interesting strategy, doesn't it? If you wanted someone to just kind of be there for you. I'm noticing the parallel between what was happening to him and what happens in our present American life. There is this feeling that was kind of generated by a lot of authors about 100 years ago, like John Dos Passos and F. Scott Fitzgerald, called the American Dream. You know, you hear people talk about the American Dream. And even though people don't put it in these terms, we always like to have it the idea that you get spiritual fulfillment through material gain. This was the strategy of Gautama Siddhartha's father. This is what was going on. That having a lot of things would be just really a wonderful way to live your life. You'd be happy if you had more things. There's a really nice little comic strip that has a lot of Buddhist messages in it, even though I don't think it's really a Buddhist comic strip, in the Milwaukee Journal called Pearls Before Swine. And they had this wonderful little comic where the one character was talking to the other character and saying, you know, I keep buying more and more things and doing more and more stuff, and I don't seem to be any happier. And the other person says, well, what does that tell you? And he says, I need to buy even more things and be even more, and do more stuff. And so we have that kind of feeling about that. But being in a situation where we accumulate more things to be happy is a really common process. And it often takes us a long time to figure out that's not going to work. But it starts at a very early age, too, though. There is a... we always talk about the children as being real Buddha masters, and they are. But even at their age, there's this kind of thing. One of the first things we do in our life, one of the first places we fall down, is the desire for possessions. And one of the people who we often talk about as being great Zen masters are the toddlers. But the first things the toddlers fall down with is they start to want things. They have the toddler rules of possession. Maybe some of you have had toddlers or no toddlers. These are going to sound familiar to you. The toddler's rules of possession are, if I like it, it's mine. If it's in my hand, it's mine. If I can take it from you, it's mine. If I had it a little while ago, it's mine. If it's mine, it must never appear to be yours in any way. And if it's broken, it's yours. So peculiar with that. So even from a very early age, and I don't think it really goes away very quickly, we're taught that more and more things happen that we need to have, and that's how we'll be better. You know, we have all of those kind of little accomplishments. And the Buddha did not particularly find this to be satisfying, and he didn't know what to do. So one day, with his trusty servant Channa, he decided he was going to go out into the streets of his kingdom. And he had this revelation there. So his father decided this was going to be the big rose parade, right? This was going to be perfect, you know. It was going to have little Snoopy floats and everything else. It was just going to be terrific. They cleared the street off of all the kinds of, you know, beggars, and they made everything look really beautiful. And he comes out of the palace, and they're strewing flowers in front of him. And he thinks this is really terrific. And then all of a sudden, he looks down an alleyway, and he sees somebody who seems to not be doing well. He's got open sores, he's coughing, he's leaning against a wall. And the Buddha goes to Channa and says, "What's wrong with this man? What's going on with him?" And Channa says, "He's ill." Well, what is illness? Illness is when the body does not work very well, Lord. And he goes, "Does this happen to everybody?" And Channa says, "Unfortunately, it does." Then he goes a little while longer, and down another alleyway, he sees a man kind of stooped over using a cane, going very slowly with gray hair and kind of withered limbs. And he goes, "Channa, what's wrong with that person?" He goes, "That person is old, sire." "What do you mean by old?" He has had a number of years that he has lived. His body has started to fail him. Things are not going as well as they did when he was younger. And the Buddha asks, "Well, will that happen to me?" He says, "Lord, if that happens enough, if you live long enough, yes, that will happen to you as well." And he finally goes down another place and comes by the river, and they're having a funeral. And there's a corpse lying out on a pyre on the river, and they're setting it on fire. And the Buddha goes to Channa, "Well, won't that hurt that man?" He says, "Lord, that man is dead." He says, "Well, what is death?" Death is the thing where our life leaves us for good, never to return. And the Buddha says, "Will that happen to me? I mean, I'm like a prince. You know, it won't happen to me, right?" And he says, "Lord, not everybody gets to be old, and not everybody experiences sickness, but everybody will die." This has become an important part of the Theravadan tradition, where every day they recite these things called the Five Remembrances, which go something like this. "I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everything I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to avoid being separated from them. And the fifth one is, my actions are the ground of being on which I stand," which is for another talk with that. So it's like, wow, that's kind of, the Buddha was like really bummed. And by the way, nowadays Theravadan monks do not get invited to a lot of parties. But he had this idea that there must be something more. And so he slipped out of the palace because he said, "Wow, I can't do this. This is just not working. There still is old age, sickness, and death, and I don't know what to do. but I'm going to leave the palace and look for an answer. So he left in the middle of the night, left his wife and young son, and went out into the wilderness. Spent about a year studying with various meditation masters, but he mastered the meditation relatively quickly and didn't really do much with that. He finally decided that since he had had all of this time with all of these sense pleasures and that didn't work out so well, he decided to go the opposite way. And he became an ascetic, somebody who ate almost nothing. There's these really interesting statues of the Buddha during this period of time where he had, you can see the bones coming. He apparently was eating only what fell into his lap. He slept sitting up. He didn't bathe. And he was doing this with five of his friends. And that always seems a little extreme too. But we may not be ascetics nowadays, but have you noticed how people will often go to the great extremes to make their lives happy? They have to work the 60-hour weeks, or they have to have 16 different classes that they're taking. So many people have not necessarily ascetics, but they decide that they have to fill their lives with all this kind of denial and busyness. Instead of just enjoying life, they have to work. A little bit different, but not too different. Did 5 years of this, and this didn't work. He finally collapsed by the side of the road, and then he was discovered. There's all these little strange coincidences that happen in history. The Buddha would never have survived if it hadn't been for this 14-year-old girl who was going off to her betrothal party. And she had this wonderful dish of milk and rice with some saffron. It was very flavorful. And he goes by and he sees this person just about dead near on the side of the road, barely conscious. And she decides to feed him. And she does, and he accepts it gratefully. And then he decides that he's not going to starve himself anymore, that the distance between the whole idea of all the sense pleasures and denial of all the sense pleasures just wasn't working for him. Little sidebar, that was one of my daughter's favorite stories when she was kind of young. And she was very intrigued when I told the story that someone was going to get married at age 14. So she asked me very calmly, like, well, Dad, how old do you have to be to get married? And of course, I didn't want to lie to her, being a nice father. I said, 30. So I kind of tried to nip that in the bud. Although she was engaged to somebody when she was in kindergarten, but that's another story. Anyway, he eventually sat under a tree all night. Mara is the kind of thing that we always talk about on the other side, where the Mara came through and is the epitome of evil. And Mara tempted him all night with women and food and wonderful flowers. And then when that didn't work, he threw warriors and storms at him. And in the morning, the Buddha got up and realized that he was on the path. Now, when I talk about the Buddha being the Buddha, I want to make it really clear that the Buddha was just a person. He was a pretty cool person, no question. But he had no special divinity and no special powers. He was enlightened just because he practiced. It's as if we took this statue here and carved it out. Let's say it was a big block of wood and we carved it out so that it became this Buddha statue. Originally it was a block of wood, and you didn't do anything to add to that to make the Buddha. That's who we are. We're blocks of wood with our Buddha inside. And that's what our practice is about. So often people talk about having to go to far-off mountains or certain monasteries to find a Buddha. And you don't have to do that. There's one on your right, there's one on your left, and there's one sitting with you. We are all Buddhas. In fact, I would make the point that enlightenment, whatever that is, this idea of having perfect peace and feeling really at ease and connected with the world, is a common occurrence that happens to so many of us. You know, have you ever had that time when you're working in your garden or doing some sort of art or listening to music or whatever, and everything seems to melt away and you're in one with that? Well, that's what it is. And the people who are really very well practiced, like the Buddha, are people who that happens to a lot, but it happens to all of us. And I'm not much of a believer in that sudden enlightenment. I think that it happens to us all. We can just practice to have it happen a little bit more. The Buddha hung around for 45 more years, doing a lot of teaching. It's a very interesting story. There's lots of little comings and goings, including assassination plots and raging elephants and all kinds of schisms in the Buddha's Sangha, his community. And that's all very interesting. If you would like to read it, there's two wonderful biographies of the Buddha out there. One is by Thich Nhat Hahn, called Old Path, White Clouds, and one's by Karen Armstrong, which is called Just the Buddha. So either one of those would be wonderful things to read if you really want to get into that kind of, you know, Russian literature type, all the kinds of things that happened. So his main thing after he became enlightened, and the main thing that I want to say that his teaching was the middle way. Neither a lot of excess nor a lot of denial. The middle way is what we always sort of talk about, finding that path in the middle. That's kind of one of the things he said. His first sermon was all about the middle way and about the Four Noble Truths. We'll talk more about the Four Noble Truths next week, but suffice it to say, he lived the rest of his life living simply, but vigorously. He enjoyed a good nap. He enjoyed good food. He was comfortable with his retinue of monks, and he was, but also gave away a lot of the ideas of all of these great luxuries. So that's one way that we can emulate the Buddha, is moderation in what we do. Could we have a sound of the bell? Let's move ahead a bit. Say 2,500 years or so. In 1926, in a small farm outside a village, Vietnam, where Thich Nhat Hahn was born. Now, Thich Nhat Hahn was born into a country that was half Buddhist, half Catholic, had been occupied by France for a long time, and was merely the kind of, like a little boy anywhere else. We always like to think that maybe it was, that there's something crazy about our society, but Thich Nhat Hahn tells this wonderful story about how he became first interested in the Buddha. He was 7 years old and he was in a bookstore and he saw a magazine. And on the magazine was a picture of the Buddha sitting calmly and peaceful. And he said, I want to be like that guy. And he looked around and he said, none of the adults that he knew were like that. Nobody was like that. So we tend to think we've got a busy society, but maybe adults everywhere. Maybe we all fall into this trap and become kind of busy, worried people. And he said, that's what I want to do. So he found that kind of thing out. When he was also very young, maybe a couple of years later, he was very excited because they were going to do a class trip. I don't know if they had permission slips back in the 1930s in Vietnam or any of those sorts of things. But they were going to go see a hermit. Wow, that's pretty cool. A hermit who lived in the mountains. They wanted to go up to this mountain that they heard the hermit was going to be there. So they made some rice balls, and they got some pots of water together, and they were all set and ready to go, and he could hardly sleep. He was so excited because he heard that the hermits were really wise and they were people, and he wanted to meet this hermit. And the day of the day, and he had this sore, great desire to meet the hermit. He had this kind of thing where he went off running up the mountain. He drank all of his water because he was so excited and thirsty. And he was the first person to arrive at the hermit's hut, and the hut was empty. And he looked around, and he was so disappointed. He didn't have the hermit that he could talk to. He was seeking this wisdom, and he didn't find it. And he was so disappointed, and he didn't know what to do. The people came up there a little bit later, and they were not as fast or as quick as he was. His teachers and the other students eventually showed up, and they all went around. And he remembers that the teachers were eating chicken as part of the picnic in the hut of the hermit. He said that shouldn't be. They shouldn't be eating chicken in a hermit's hut. So he's all exhausted and tired, and he's thirsty because he drank all of his water, and it was a warm day, and he was running. So he went and finally traveled around, and he heard some water running. And there was a little well, a little stream with a little well that was around the corner from where the hermit's hut was. And he drank readily from the well. And he thought that was his answer to wanting to get wisdom, is the hermit had become the well. That was what he had this idea of. And one of the great lessons of all of this is that we find teachings in very unexpected places. And often just trying really hard doesn't work. Just letting the practice come to you. He wanted desperately to meet the hermit, but he met the hermit in the well. He took a nap, and when he woke up, all of the people were leaving, and he realized very happily that he had met the hermit in his own way. He has had this wonderful career, although it was marked by great tragedy. The tragedy was the Vietnam War occurred, and as he was a young monk, he realized he couldn't stay in the monastery, so he started doing engaged Buddhism in the countryside. He would help rebuild the villages that had been burned. He would feed people who were destitute. He would comfort people who had lost. And he developed a thing called the School for Youth and Social Service. And because people didn't want to accept that someone was just a neutral person in that particular time, he was ostracized. The people on the north thought that he was a dupe of the United States. And the United States thought that he, and South Vietnam, thought he was a friend of the North Vietnamese. So, sadly, he had to leave the country. Or he left the country once and they said, don't come back. You will be killed. And he was exiled from Vietnam at the age of 40 rather, and lived in France. And he didn't return there until another 40 years after that, when he was 80, was when he finally actually got back to Vietnam. Now, many of us have a great feeling of almost shame and embarrassment about the Vietnam War, and I think there's some reasonable idea about that. The Vietnam War was a very difficult thing. Yet, without the Vietnam War, Thich Nhat Hanh does not become exiled and doesn't bring the Dharma to the West. And this center, and my practice in particular, but the practice of so many other people, doesn't flourish. We find so much going on in unexpected places. Thich Nhat Hanh taught a few things about very, very simple mindfulness. One is just conscious breathing. It can't be that simple that we can just breathe and everything will be better. But yes, it was one of those wonderful things. So I'd like to have the bell invited one more time. And then at the sound of the bell, we'll just take one perfect conscious breath. Isn't that beautiful? It's amazing how we can do that. That Thich Nhat Hanh and other people have taught us that just the breath, just one simple breath, can be a big change in your life. The other thing that happens is he talks about the smile. I don't know very many Zen masters that talk about the smile so much. But the smile is a wonderful thing to bring to your face. He has said, your smile may be an indication of your happiness, but your happiness may be also caused by your smile. So he has this kind of idea that when we're meditating, we just have this little bit of a smile. There's a little, I'll tell you about this book in a moment. But there's a little poem in here about smiling even if you don't feel like it. I seem to have lost it. Here we go. Breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile. Dwelling in the present moment, I know this is a wonderful moment. And those of us who have been practicing for a while, in, out, smile, calm. How wonderful it is just to be able to sit and smile. This, incidentally, was my first exposure to Thich Nhat Hanh. And like many other accidents of the world, it happened because of an act of great laziness. If people remember back, you may have been one of those people, but I belong to a thing called the Quality Paperback Book Club. And in 1993, they sent me a book in the mail, but I was too lazy to open the thing up, and I didn't send it back, and all of a sudden, oh, well, I might as well keep the book. And it was this book. It was by a person, like most people, I didn't know how to pronounce his name, Thich Nhat Hanh. And then he had a retreat 4 months later in northern Illinois, and that's when I knew that I had my teacher. It's always very interesting how all of these things become fortuitous. And they can fall into that. But Thich Nhat Hanh is such a wonderful practitioner because he has become a real teacher of people in the West. He came from Vietnam. He lived in Vietnam. And most of us, if we had to go live in Vietnam, even if we knew quite a bit about meditation, etc., we would have a difficult time teaching Vietnamese how to meditate, we don't know the culture. He has become really very useful in the culture, has written many, many books. But it all comes down to this. Just be present. However it is. However you can do that. So we often talk a little bit in many of these Zen things about sitting meditation. Thich Nhat Hahn says, even if you don't feel like doing sitting meditation, don't do it. Which I thought, my goodness, he's going to lose his Zen master union card by saying that. That we have many ways. There are 84,000 Dharma doors, is what the Buddha said. There are 84,000 ways to be mindful. And in the future weeks, I'll talk more about why that is and how that fits. But right now, I just want to get people inspired to practice. Just that simple conscious breath, that simple smile. It can't be that easy, you say. And I say, why not? Could we have another sound of the bell? The other person I want to talk about, I said we would get to the third person. The third person is you. There you are. You are not different than Thich Nhat Hahn or the Buddha, at least in your ability to be aware, awake, happy, balanced. All of that can happen to you. You too can carve yourself out of a woodblock and be a Buddha. As I said, enlightenment is not a rare phenomenon. It's rare that it happens frequently in our lives, but we have those moments, and we can have more of those moments. So many people have this terrible idea about themselves, and I know this. You feel like you're unworthy. You feel like you're not a very good person somehow. You never could be a meditator. After all, your mind just goes around too crazy. You could never be a student of the Dharma. You could never be that mindful. And yes, you all can. That's the real thing. There's a wonderful quote. Often it is attributed to Nelson Mandela, since Nelson Mandela did it at his inauguration. But it's by Marianne Williamson, and I'm just going to change a few words here. She writes about the child of God, but I like to use Buddha nature. But it's a wonderful quote nevertheless. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not be? You are the child of Buddha. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were all meant to shine as children do. We were born to manifest our Buddha nature that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Isn't that a wonderful sentiment? And I believe it is so true. I have yet to meet anybody who I can't see the Buddha nature and at least partially through there. There's a shape taking place in that little block of wood in all of our practice. The first thing to do is to sit and embrace that light. If it feels like you're being chased by a tiger or a runaway truck, the next thing I say may sound a little odd, a little crazy, but it is true. Turn around and embrace that truck. You will not die. We turn towards our lives in all of its manifestations, and we will be able to become liberated. We'll be able to become that person of peace. We'll be able to become that Buddha. We will be able to become like Thich. Actually, one of my favorite things that Thich said was, as he has led his life so exemplary, is he has a wonderful question and answer periods at the end of his retreats. And the very last question was great because it was the last one of the night. It was a very simple question and a very simple answer. He's obviously a poet, a gardener. He has, I guess, somebody told me he has 1 million Facebook friends. Now, there's some accomplishment, right? He has said, somebody asked, what do you do for fun? And he said, everything I do is for fun. Wouldn't that be a wonderful way to be? Wouldn't it be wonderful that if your entire life, everything was interesting and alive and that sort of thing? So let's start by just taking in, embracing our life. Another great poem by Derek Walcott called Love After Love. The time will come when with elation you will arrive. Greet yourself at your own door in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself. To the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit and feast on your life. I love that image of feasting on your life. You know, we have, especially those Theravada monks saying their Five Remembrances about death and old age and illness. And we'll talk about the Five Remembrances again in future weeks. But the other part about that is that life is incredibly open to us right now. Thich Nhat Hahn talks about our appointment with life. Our appointment with life that we miss if we don't open ourselves to the full beauty of it. And I agree. I mean, I'm saying that this sounds so simple. We all need help. We all need practice. And again, next week, my talk will be called The Problem. I'll explain why this is somewhat difficult. But I just want to give people the idea that, yes, you can kind of do this. That life is very available in the present moment. And as a matter of fact, that's the only place it's available. And that you can be inspired to practice and reclaim your life. Remember back with the toddlers? They were always so alive and vibrant, you know. If you gave a toddler that chocolate chip cookie, then they would just be one with the chocolate chip cookie, right? They didn't have to do anything special. They didn't have to do any exercise. They were like that. In fact, that's one of the Thich Nhat Hahn stories he likes to also talk about, is when he was young, before he became a Buddhist, of course, when he was just a schoolboy, they go to the village to, once every 2 weeks to get, the kind of supplies they couldn't have on the farm. And he would get a cookie, and he'd hide himself, and he'd spend 2 hours eating this one cookie. Isn't that wonderful? So I would like to just end with this really wonderful poem by Thich Nhat Hahn. The good news. The good news they do not print. The good news we do print. We have a special edition every moment, and we need you to read it. The good news is that you are alive, that the linden tree is still there, standing firm in the harsh winter. The good news is that you have wonderful eyes to touch the blue sky. The good news is that your child is there before you, and your arms are available. Hugging is possible. They only print what is wrong. Look at each of our special editions. We always offer the things that are not wrong. We want you to benefit from them and help protect them. The dandelion is there by the sidewalk, smiling its wonderful smile. singing the song of eternity. Listen, you have ears, you can hear it. Bow your head, listen to it. Leave behind the world of preoccupation and sorrow and get free. The latest good news is you can do it. One more sound of the bell, please. Thank you all. The next 3 talks are called The Problem, the Solution, and Happiness is Not an Individual Matter, and I hope you can join me with that. Are there any questions tonight or comments at all? So Nancy has this wonderful question. What happened to the Buddha's wife and child? Well, eventually, started out they were kind of annoyed, or at least his wife was kind of annoyed. You know, kind of is interesting. In some ways, the Buddha was the first deadbeat dad, but or the most famous one. But he had this desire to find liberation for everybody. And after several years, he did come back to his hometown. Eventually, his wife and his son joined the monastics when they got older, and sort of forgave them that kind of thing. But that was one of those things that was very difficult for him, is the idea that being a householder was something that a lot of people thought might be a good thing. And also, one of the real interesting things about the Buddha's life was that even though he promoted monastics, especially near the end of his life, he had quite a few people who were lay people who were followers. And he absolutely agreed that lay people could continue to progress along the path, but it wasn't necessarily for him. Yes, so his son was named Rahula, and his wife is Yosadhara. And the other interesting part about Yosadhara and the Buddha's aunt, the Buddha's mother died in childbirth, but he was raised by his aunt. And his aunt and Yosadhara decided just to come on the Buddha. The Buddha asked, many people had asked before they did this, can women be monastics? I mean, why can't women be monastics? And the Buddha said, no, they don't think so. There was a lot of concern about danger, that they would be susceptible to just not an easy life necessarily. They wouldn't be able to protect them. And eventually, though, however, Yosadhara and the Buddha's aunt, Pajapati, showed up with their heads shaved and said, well, whether you take us in as nuns or not, we're going to practice like nuns. And the Buddha eventually did invite them into the Sangha. Thich Nhat Hahn also often talks about what is called the fourfold Sangha, lay men, lay women, monks and nuns, as kind of an overall picture of that. So, but yes, many people have raised eyebrows at, I mean, he just walked out on his family, and so. Anyone else? Yes? So the question is what I think of the Hermann Hesse's book, Siddhartha. It's wonderful little look into the time of the Buddha. Gives you a little bit of that background. That's something I didn't talk about very much, but you know, the Buddha was living in a time when things like cities and states and religions were all relatively new. I mean, civilization was not very old at that time, and there were not very many formal kinds of things like, you know, countries and those sorts of things. He also lived at this very peculiar time of life called the Axial Age. And the Axial Age is this time from about 1000 BC to about 200 BC, where there was this great evolving of religious and philosophical thought everywhere in the modern world. So In Athens, they were having the age of Pericles and the golden age there. Zoroaster actually was the person who probably got it started in Persia. There were Jains in India besides the Buddhists. There was Confucianism and then Taoism in China. So all of this great churning of thought was going on at that time. So I like Siddhartha. I don't know how accurate or inaccurate it is, but it's a very interesting look into the time of that was going on there. So, anything else?
You mentioned embracing the heart.
Yes.
And I know Nam talks about that.
Yeah.
You know, embracing our loss and anger and fear
Yeah.
and anxiety. And we look at, I look at it as negative.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, what does that look like?
Yeah. The question is about the question is about embracing the truck, embracing the tiger who's coming after you. It looks like this. You spend time observing, and that means body sensations and thoughts that are associated with those things, and you just observe them and you be with them. And one of the problems with the tiger or the truck is they never slow down. You'll always be running from them. It is peculiar, to say the least, because many of the things that we like to avoid, like pain and suffering, are things that seem rather odd that we would turn towards. But the only way to really resolve such things as anger and fear, hatred, depression, anxiety, is to turn towards them. And it looks like observing and being with them. There's this wonderful thing that Thich talks about in one of his books, actually in a couple of his books, called Inviting Mara to Tea. I didn't mention that even though you all have Buddha nature, isn't it great? We're all sitting here, all Buddhas. We all have Mara nature too. We all have this thing called Mara nature, which is our nasty side. And Thich Nhat Hahn talks about, he has this whole idea of the Buddha is sitting in a cave, he's kind of hanging out, Ananda is there, and Ananda is his servant, and Ananda's making tea, and Mara comes to the front of the cave, and he says to Ananda, I want to have a meeting with the Buddha. And Ananda says, you can't have a meeting with the Buddha, you're his enemy. And he says, did your teacher ever tell you he had enemies? So Ananda very reluctantly comes in there. And Buddha and Mara have this wonderful conversation. Like the Buddha saying, oh, my good friend, sit down and tell me, how are things going? And he said, oh, it's not so good. They're doing all kinds of nasty things in my name. And they just think that they're just so lazy. My followers don't get anywhere. And the Buddha says, oh, I know what you mean. They put me on top of a car and drive me around I never wanted to be on top of a car, that kind of a thing. And it is this idea that our Mara nature and our Buddha nature are intertwined, they inter-are, and that we should be friends with them. There is absolutely no compulsion to act out all of those things that are part of Mara, all of our anger, fear, and anxiety. But it certainly is important to acknowledge that. It is certainly important to sit down and have a cup of tea with your anger and fear. Then they don't become overwhelming for you. Does that sound about right? We can talk more about that, yes, if you like. So, anyone else have questions tonight? Well, I thank you all for your kind attention. We'll have one final bell. A lotus to you, Buddha's all.